increasingly the US had kind of went with what they call the CAFE standards, right? The corporate average fuel economy standards. They wanted to increase the total amount of like miles per gallon that a manufacturer is putting out. Okay, so when I say manufacturer, we're talking like Chevrolet, Honda, Ford, Chrysler, pretty much all like the big auto manufacturers. The US basically wanted to crank up the corporate average fuel economy. So like a truck, let's say, would get 10 miles of the gallon and a car would get 20 miles of the gallon. Okay, so your corporate average fuel economy, if we're just looking at those two vehicles, is 15 miles of the gallon, right? So if you sell a shitload of trucks and only a few cars, then your corporate average fuel economy is going to get dragged down. Well, according to the US government, and Trump actually just reversed this, which actually was a legitimately good move that he did. The basic concept was you have to sell a shitload of vehicles that get really good fuel mileage so you could sell more trucks because we're trying to improve the environment because, oh my God, we're going to kill all the babies, goldfish, and trees, and the entire environment's going to come collapsing down around us if we don't do something about all these emissions being put out by all these vehicles. So corporate average fuel economy standards had kind of got put in here, and they were also trying to reduce it, as I said, back in like the late 60s, early 70s. So they started putting on all these emissions controls.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 407. I'm talking to Kyle Matovcik. He has his own show, and we're going to talk liberty and health, and we're going to talk about what's been happening with cars over the last 40 or 50 years, why they seem to be getting more expensive, and what we can do about that, or why this has happened. How are you, Kyle?
I'm absolutely fantastic. Chris, it's good to be with you again. I know last time we talked, it was quite a few years ago, and we talked about Manosphere stuff. It was a long show, good show. But yeah, I can't believe I can't even remember how many years ago that was, but I know it was quite a while ago. So it's good to be back with you.
Yeah, it was a while, and that was one of the longest shows I did because there was just so much to talk about. But anyway, and of course you're a dad now, so. But anyway, so you are you're a full-time, I guess now it's auto technician, auto mechanic, and I guess your father and your grandfathers were too.
Yeah. So I guess before we kind of get into all the automotive stuff today, not that I ever try to make the argument from authority, but I'm going to give people a background as to why they should at least consider my opinion and perhaps trust me in some respects, which, we're just two strangers to probably people listening, talking on the internet. But if it gives you any solace, then okay, yeah, I run the In Liberty and Health podcast. I play in a band. I'm an athlete. I'm a father. But for the last 15 years, I've been an automotive technician, right? So, and like you said, my grandfather, my grandfather's father, and then my father have all been automotive technicians. So I am a fourth generation mechanic. They've pretty much all owned automotive businesses in the southwestern Pennsylvania area for the last, probably almost maybe even over 100 years. I've had people come up to me that said, all right, I watched your grandfather grow up, I watched your dad grow up, and now I'm watching you grow up. And it's really, really cool to see and to meet all sorts of people that knew my family, perhaps even better than I have. So that kind of lays down a little bit of the groundwork as to like my history with the automotive industry. I started working for my dad when I was about 17 years old, and he had always been a mechanic his entire life. And once again, his dad and then his dad's dad was a mechanic as well. So my dad's been in the independent automotive industry, owning his own shop since about 2003. And he's done very, very well for himself. Back in the early 2000s, he would be in what you would call the 1%. He had two guys working for him, and then obviously he would do some stuff as well, like mostly running the shop that he worked for. He worked for dealerships for about 10, 20 years, and then once again went into business for himself. So like I said, much like my dad, I eventually decided that I'm going to go to college for this. I'm going to go to trade school. So I went through about 5 years of trade school, 3 years in high school, and then about a year and a half once I got out of school, and also did like a lot of General Motors training. So I've worked for GM since 2013. I started for a Chevrolet dealership back in 2013. Worked there for about a year and a half. Like I said before that, I worked for my dad over the summer at his independent shop. Once I graduated high school and had moved out to college, I took about 6 months off of working, and then I finally went back to working. I was working full time hours while I was going to school. Worked at an NTB out in Ohio for about 5 months, then went to another Chevy dealership for about 7 months. Graduated college, moved back to Pennsylvania, and then started working at one of the highest volume GM dealers in all of this part of Pennsylvania for about 5.5 years. And then I ended up at the job I'm at now at a Buick GMC dealership in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. So that's a little bit of my background. I am through General Motors 100% certified in pretty much every single GM area, with the exception of automatic transmissions and diesels. I am one of our high voltage guys, so I've been working on hybrids now for the last couple of years. I was the first one in our dealership to put a high voltage battery inside of a Hummer. They have me disconnect stuff at the body shop every here and there. So my experience with automobiles is pretty extensive, because once again, I've been doing it for since right after I cut my hair in high school. So like I said, my experience is very extensive. My family's experience is very extensive, and I don't foresee myself leaving this field. But it's been very, very good to me. I do make about double the average salary of the average automotive technician. So I think that's why, like I said, I just kind of wanted to lay out the foundation of why people should at least hear me out when it comes to automotive stuff, because I am also the lead tech, or one of the lead techs in my shop. The only other guy who has more experience than me is the guy who's been there for in the shop that I work in for 25 years. I've been at the shop I've worked at now for about 5 years. So like I said, I just feel like it's probably good to at least establish my automotive cred before we start kind of going down all these rabbit holes. Oh, and also for my college experience, I did go to Ohio Technical College for a year and a half, and I graduated as the most recognized student with the most certifications, and at the top of my class with a 94% average. So people probably aren't used to hearing me talk about automotive stuff, but I promise you, I know more than just about everybody you're going to talk to when it comes to automotive stuff.
Yeah, you cut your hair. You really don't want to have long hair and work on cars.
No, no, I've heard horror stories, and I cut it when I was about 17 years old. I had probably all the way down to my chest, but now unfortunately all my hair fell out. So it's good either way. But the automotive industry has been good enough to me, but I've also was good enough to it, and was very industrious and very, very dedicated to my craft to make sure that I kind of get to the top of my field. And at 31 years old, I am pretty honored to say that I get flown out to places. Like, I literally had a job pay to fly me down to Florida, put me up in a beautiful hotel, give me a loaner for the weekend and everything like that. So I've had other jobs offer to fly me out to different parts of the country. Just really, really good job opportunities. But where I work now is very good. I work with absolutely fantastic people. And like I said, the automotive industry is brutal, but if you're willing to put in an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, then you can most of the time get that. Not all the time, but most of the time.
That's wild. I certainly hear of doctors getting flown out. I've never heard of auto mechanics getting flown out. That is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, once again, the automotive industry is really, really hurting for people. The average pay for technicians, at least about 10 years ago, was about $38,000, and nowadays I think it's moving up towards about like 48 to like 60 grand a year. Now, just full transparency, I do make well above both those numbers. But once again, when I was in college, I got all my automotive service excellence certifications, which is basically a third-party test that you have to take to certify that you're a master technician. I recertified, so I have a little magnet on my box. Trying to think, like, I've done all sorts of classes where basically you go after work and then do that. In Pennsylvania, you have to have a state inspection and emissions license, because we have certain testings here to basically verify that vehicles are safe to be on the road and they're not putting out too many emissions. So you also have to have certain certification to carry around refrigerant. I got that too. I'm trying to think of what else, but yeah, pretty much everything automotive when it comes to the state of Pennsylvania, I've done it for, once again, over 10 years.
Okay. Yeah. So it's been in the family business. I imagine that creates a lot of pressure. But what are your dad, grandfather still alive?
My father is my grandfather passed away about 15 years ago, and it honestly it kind of breaks my heart because I wish he could see everything that I do today, and I know he'd be absolutely floored with it. Perhaps a little bit more interesting history would be that my grandfather had owned shops, and he was making $50,000 back in like 1969. So you have to imagine for inflation adjusted dollars, that's probably well into almost $200,000 territory. So my family owned two gas stations, not Sunoco's, not Sitco's, but I can't. They own two gas stations down Creighton, Pennsylvania, for years and years and years. My uncle Goose and my grandfather Rich, who were, it was kind of crazy to me to see when I went to my grandfather's funeral, and I kicked myself in the ass for not hanging around longer. But um, there were people wrapped around the building to pay their respects to my grandfather because in the area that I live in, everybody knew who Rich was. Everybody knew my pap, and now everybody knows my dad. When people meet me, oh, you're Glenny's kid. Oh, nice to meet you. So it's really really cool. So to touch on like a slightly political point, I guess is just like more important than politics is having a network, and through the automotive industry and through having a loyal customer base that my father built, I am able to have a lot of really, really good connections, a really good network.
Yeah, that's great. Because your grandfather was working in the industry when every gas station was a service station.
hmm Yeah, and that's exactly what my grandfather and his brother had both owned way, 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 way back then. And then my grandfather had retired, I want to say in the mid 90s, and then my dad had kind of built himself up. So some people would say that, like, oh, your grandfather just handed your dad all this stuff. My dad really built his own shop from the ground up. And there's probably, I'm not even kidding when I say it's millions of dollars worth of equipment in a small two-bay shop that he's ran independently for the last, 20, 25 years ish.
I've heard that one of the reasons why full service gas died was because of Nixon's price controls. Is that true?
As far as that's concerned, I can't say I'm exactly that familiar with it, but I would believe probably like minimum wage and stuff like that probably helped kill that and some of the emission standards because, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, I'm sure, vehicles had continued to get more and more and more advanced, particularly after like 1969 when they started to really do a lot of these emissions controls. So that's when you saw vehicles go from what they were rated at was like 350 horsepower, but they actually had like sometimes over 800 horsepower in some of these vehicles. They were putting out a lot of emissions. So like some of them, people would joke that they get gallons to the mile rather than miles to the gallon. Like some of these vehicles, like your old 427 Corvette probably got like honestly 8 miles to the gallon, maybe. And that's might even be pushing it, but they ran awesome and they sounded cool. But there was no denying that they were putting out a lot of stuff in the atmosphere. And, past 1969, they really wanted to kind of tamp down on that. So they got a little bit more difficult to work on, started using a lot of vacuum stuff. They had these giant air pumps on the front of engines to basically pump air into the exhaust to help kind of calm all the emission stuff, put catalytic converters on stuff, which catalytic converters have platinum, rhodium, and palladium in them, which basically allows the hydrocarbons that come out of the engine to go through the catalytic converter. And then it adds certain molecules to it to basically make it into water and to make it a little bit more breathable air. Well, a lot of that stuff did come at the cost of performance because you're changing the back pressure that's in the exhaust, which does, once again, it makes the air a little bit cleaner, but at the cost of performance. So that's why you could get like a Corvette in, I think it was like 1972 that had, 350 cubic inch motor with only 180 horsepower, which by today's standards, my wife's Terrain is a 3.6 liter Terrain that has 301 horsepower for 3.6 liters versus a 350 cubic inch engine with 180 horsepower, which is just absolute dog shit.
Well, I'm old enough to remember station wagons and when cars really were big, and I'm also old enough to remember when, you had regular and unleaded, and regular gas meant it was leaded gasoline.
hmm
What happened there?
The leaded gasoline, they say that it led to like a lot of cancer. So that's also what they did with like did away with a lot of the asbestos, because they said like a lot of those pollutants was leading to cancer. As to how extensive that research is, I'm not exactly very well versed on that, but it does seem pretty apparent because you see a lot of older guys who've been doing it for a long time and they're in pretty rough shape. Now, some of that could be lifestyle, but I do believe that like some of the stuff that was in vehicles forever ago was probably harmful to humans. Um, they really wanted to clean vehicles up. Like the standard is they basically want you to be able to put your mouth on the tailpipe and get no negative detrimental effects from it. So like in Pennsylvania, they used to have the tailpipe test, which is where you would have to run a vehicle at 2000 RPMs and stick a probe into the tailpipe, and then it measures the emissions and you get a pass or fail. The general joke was is that we would get the cleanest vehicle we could find in the parking lot, at least when I worked for my dad, because most places got rid of these tailpipe tests. You still have to use them for 8,500 pounds to 9,000 pounds for vehicles. You would get like a little four-cylinder vehicle and stick the probe in there and then put the RPM measure, like basically a tachometer, on the vehicle that you're running, get it to 2000 RPM, and then measure the emissions coming out of a clean tailpipe, because you would never know it was actually what you were going to get if you measured the tailpipe out of like an 8,500 pound or like a pre 1995 vehicle, because it was just so unreliable.
So really, what happened to station wagons and what happened to some of these giant cars, like my parents' 1970 Mercury Marquis, which was enormous.
Mhm.
You couldn't park a lot of these cars in parking lots today.
Yeah, you know what? I was honestly a very big fan of those vehicles back in the day. My dad, when I was working for him, eventually bought this 1990 Chevy Caprice, which, if you remember what those were like, they were like the old police cars. They were the same thing as the Impala SS. They were enormous. And the joke always was, it was like driving your couch, right? You could drive them, you could put your pinky on the steering wheel and pretty much wiggle it back and forth, and it would just move whatever way, because like the power assist on it was so great. So basically what happened is that increasingly the US had kind of went with what they call the cafe standards, right? The corporate average fuel economy standards. They wanted to increase the total amount of like miles per gallon that a manufacturer is putting out. Okay, so when I say manufacturer, we're talking like Chevrolet, Honda, Ford, Chrysler, pretty much all like the big auto manufacturers. The US basically wanted to crank up the corporate average fuel economy. So like a truck, let's say, would get 10 miles of the gallon, and a car would get 20 miles of the gallon. Okay, so your corporate average fuel economy, if we're just looking at those two vehicles, is 15 miles of the gallon, right? So if you sell a shitload of trucks and only a few cars, then your corporate average fuel economy is going to get dragged down. Well, according to the US government, and Trump actually just reversed this, which actually was a legitimately good move that he did. The basic concept was you have to sell a shitload of vehicles that get really good fuel mileage so you could sell more trucks, because we're trying to improve the environment, because oh my god, we're going to kill all the babies, goldfish, and trees, and the entire environment's going to come collapsing down around us if we don't do something about all these emissions being put out by all these vehicles. So corporate average fuel economy standards had kind of got put in here, and they were also trying to reduce it, as I said, back in like the late 60s, early 70s. So they started putting on all these emissions controls, and that required, making a little bit more environmentally friendly vehicles. You're going to start making 4 cylinders instead of 8 cylinders. You're going to start making 6 cylinders, and we need to really get as much bang for your buck out of a small engine. So definitely over the last like 15 years or so, you've seen a lot more 4-cylinder turbos, because engines basically run by doing what's called the engines run with intake, compression, power, and exhaust. It's 4 strokes of an engine, right? So when you do the intake stroke, the piston comes down in the engine, which sucks in air and fuel, and then compression compresses all that, and then intake, compression, power. The power stroke is when the spark plug fires, and then the piston comes back down and it explodes that air and fuel inside the cylinder that was just compressed. And so when it goes down, that's basically what allows the engine to turn, and then the exhaust is pushing the exhaust back up in the cylinder out. And obviously you have your intake and exhaust valves. Basically what they want to do is get the most out of that. So when you put a turbo on a little 4-cylinder, you're forcing more air in through the exhaust, because you have a turbo with a impeller wheel and a propeller wheel. So as the exhaust goes out, this wheel spinning, which turns this wheel, which forces more air into the engine. So which creates more power out of a smaller engine. So, you see in high performance cars, they always put superchargers on like a big V8 engine, or like, everybody's seeing the drag vehicles, which have these giant blowers and these throttle bodies up top. You're basically just trying to get as much air into the engine and dump as much fuel as possible into the engine to create as much power as possible. Okay, well, if you do the big V8 engine and a carburetor, then you're going to create a lot of emissions. Well, once again, the US didn't want that anymore, because we're trying to be green and environmentally friendly. So, like I said, the CAFE standards, emissions controls were basically put onto vehicles to change that. Okay, so now to your point about station wagons and bigger vehicles, in order to pull all these bigger vehicles, you needed big engines. Okay, well, CAFE standards basically said, okay, you can't do that. And demand over time, and I'm sure you know this as of recently, pretty much everything is like a mini SUV on wheels now at this point, specifically from the domestic manufacturers. Like Buick doesn't make a car anymore. They have the Enclave, the Envision, the Encore GX, and the Vista, right? There's no cars anymore. They don't make a Regal, they don't make a LaCrosse, they don't make a Rivian, or no, not Rivian.
Riviera.
Riviera, thank you. They don't make any of those cars anymore because the demand really isn't there as much anymore. And plus, those cars were in a different category for the cafe standards, and they would have had to get much, much better fuel mileage compared to like a truck or something like that. So, like, okay, well, we'll just make an SUV so that way we can basically rig our cafe standards to get a little bit better gas mileage, which is truly tragic because, like me, I'm still driving a Cobalt. My Cobalt's a 2015 that I had to pick up from Virginia because I don't want to drive a newer vehicle with a turbo engine because they cost way more to fix. If you have to replace a turbocharger, you're looking, if you take it to a dealership, you're probably looking anywhere from, I would say, 1,500 on the low end if you're lucky, all the way up to probably $3,000. And most older vehicles didn't really have a lot of that stuff. So basically, the cafe standards made it borderline illegal to have a lot of these bigger vehicles because, once again, they're in a different category for the cafe standards. So all the domestic manufacturers said, well, we're just not going to make cars anymore. Now, like the foreign auto manufacturers, they've been able to kind of get around that a little bit because, once again, their home countries don't really have the same emission standards, but also their cars were pretty good on gas. So, but even they're kind of moving away from that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, but that's kind of an approximation of what I'm like the way I see it.
Well, another thing we got to talk about is just the amazing rise in gas prices in the 70s.
Mhm.
I when I was, growing up in the 70s, all the small cars were not Americans. All the
Mhm.
big cars were Americans. Japan, had the Toyota, had the Corolla.
Mhm.
It was Datsun, and it was Honda. Honda
Mhm.
got into the car business, although Honda started with motorcycles. And it was in 1981 that Honda actually opened up their plant in Marysville, Ohio. That was
Mhm.
a big deal
Yeah.
because the Japanese car company is now going to make cars here. It was, do you think maybe American car manufacturers got lazy because they were so far ahead?
Um, yeah, honestly, I don't really know that. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with them necessarily being lazy. I think it was just more of domestically they were getting hurt by the government more than anything, and they were trying to compete with like you said, Honda and Datsun because, not ever those smaller vehicles got better gas mileage. So I'm sure the domestic population was probably like, wait, I'm driving this old Chevelle or Chevette or something like that. And like this Datsun, this Honda is just completely whooping its ass on gas mileage. So eventually the domestic manufacturers were like, okay, well, we have to compete with this. So that's when you saw the Sunbird, the Cavalier, the Pinto, the Chevette, all these, small junky cars that were trying to compete with the foreign vehicles. Because, once again, if you're driving an old Chevy 350 out of like a Sierra or Silverado or something like that, the gas mileage was dog shit. And like, granted, back then people really didn't commute as much as they do now, but they were probably looking at those and like, all right, well, we're gonna have to compete with that. And to think back to then, also, you got to remember back in 1970, they were going off the gold standard and all that. So,
Yeah,
I don't know how much that affected gas prices, but I have to imagine that there were a lot of different factors moving away from leaded gas and all these emission standards and reducing power in vehicles probably led to like a rise in gas prices because there was a higher demand for gas prices. A funny little thing that I also try to tell people that just makes me laugh hysterically: the last Corvette my grandfather owned, right? 2000 silver Corvette, convertible LS1, which is like the ideal V8 in the early 2000s that everybody wants. And a side tangent, there are more claims that there are LS motors than there are actually LS motors in the world. Like, people have no idea what they're talking about when they say, "Oh, I have an LS motor." Well, what'd you get it out of? I got it out of a truck. That's not an LS motor. Like, an LS1 is a very specific engine that, like in a Corvette, there's only so many LS1 Corvettes in the world. The LS1 that went into like the Firebirds and the Camaros was a completely different LS1 than the one that was in the Corvettes. Okay, so just a little side tangent aside. The reason why I bring this up is because my dad's 2001 or 2000 silver convertible LS1 Corvette, which is the last one my grandfather owned, and I have the last one that my uncle Bob owned in my garage, a 1986 Corvette red with like 1,700 or like 2,000 miles on it. It's absolutely beautiful, immaculate. It's like driving a time capsule. Um, my dad's silver 2000 Corvette with an LS1, a VRAM intake, a custom Vortex centrifugal supercharger, and vents that go down to the lower intake This thing, if you set it to cruise control on 80 miles an hour, will get 33 miles to the gallon. A V8 that is probably tuned well over 600 horsepower, 33 miles to the gallon. No catalytic converters. It breathes, it puts out tons of power, and 33 miles to the gallon. Okay, now that's because the Corvette's a very light car, but also that engine is very efficient at what it does, right? So it's always kind of puzzled me why, GM won't say, well, why don't we just try to make like the best engine possible and it'll get better gas mileage. Instead, they're trying to do cars now do what's called direct injection rather than fuel injection, right? Which is a evolution from throttle body injection before, which came after carburation. So carburetors were basically like a little throttle body that sat on top of the engine, and then you had vacuum that pulled fuel into the engine and mixed it with air as it went down from the carburetor through the intake to the valves, and then it got sucked into the engine and then used, right? That was not a very efficient way to get fuel to the cylinder, but it was a very efficient way to mix fuel and fuel and air from the intake all the way down to the cylinder, right? So then they moved to throttle body injection, which is basically where you had an electric injector sitting on top of the throttle body that sprayed fuel into the throttle body. Okay, so a little bit different than a carburetor, but still kind of the same concept. So then I want to say in probably the 80s, late 80s, maybe even early 90s, they started moving over more and more vehicles over to fuel injection, right? Like an old 3800 out of like a GM, like a GM car would have had a 3800 with fuel injection, right? So now we moved from throttle body injection to fuel injectors, which were, an individual injector sitting on top of each cylinder, spraying fuel on the back of the intake valve, right? So that was actually a pretty efficient way to get fuel from the fuel tank to the injectors straight to the intake valve and into the cylinder, right? You had about 60 psi then at that point going right into the intake valve and into the cylinder. And there is a benefit. It washed the back face of the valve, which I'll actually get into why this is important here in a minute. So the manufacturers wanted to get more power out of the vehicle. So they began to do what diesels do, and that's what's called direct injection. So instead of having a fuel injector that sprays fuel onto the back face of the valve, now they have gone to direct injection, which is basically on the compression stroke. Remember how I talked about intake? When you go on the intake stroke, you're sucking in air and fuel. Well, now instead you have a direct injector that's right into the cylinder head rather than spraying the back face of the valve, and it shoots fuel at about 3,000 psi sometimes directly into the cylinder on the compression stroke, so that way you're getting as much pressure on that power stroke up, and then it detonates, which gives you your power stroke. Now, the problem with this direct injection is that you're not washing the back face of the valve. Okay, well, why does this even matter? We're going to go back to emissions now for a second. Carbon is enemy number one. Okay, so carbon is a byproduct of basically combustion and an engine running over time, right? So when you don't spray the back face of the valve on that exhaust stroke, whenever you're pushing all those hydrocarbons and unburned fuel and everything out of the cylinder, that has to go somewhere, right? Well, it goes to the exhaust, but the problem is it also passes the cylinder head. When it's passing the cylinder head, that carbon will eventually begin to rest on the intake valve. Okay, Kyle, why does this matter? This matters because carbon acts as a sponge. I've seen videos of this. It's actually very, very interesting. So for those listening, you probably want to go look this up. But when fuel is sprayed into a cold engine, so imagine, Chris, I don't know exactly where you're at, but I imagine you're probably in like I think you're on a different time zone. But if it's cold for you, it's cold for me, right? So in Pennsylvania, good.
Yeah, if it's cold for you, it's cold for me.
Okay, yeah, it's 32 degrees right now in Pennsylvania. So right now, if I went out to go start my wife's car, her 3.6 liter train with the direct injection, that carbon sitting on the back face of the valve will actually soak up that fuel, which is going to hinder performance, potentially create misfires, and put out excessive emissions because you're not burning those hydrocarbons that are going into the cylinder. This creates a problem for emissions. So I know I'm on a whole long tangent here, but just bear with me. This goes back to the whole point of like fuel efficiency and also emissions, which is part of the reason why we can't have cars and why they're pushing these 4-cylinder turbos so hard. With a direct injected motor, when you don't wash the back face of the valve, eventually carbon builds up on the back of that valve, and that carbon actually soaks up fuel on a cold start, requiring more fuel to go into the cylinder, which uses up more fuel, which we don't want to do. right? So this is the problem with direct injection, and this is a problem that a lot of the auto manufacturers are facing now. Is that, hey, we have carbon on the back face of the valves. Okay, so you could do like an induction service, which basically is supposed to help wash some of that, but you still have that problem with carbon, right? So when you think about automotive stuff in general, carbon is enemy number one because once again, this soaks up gas, which requires more and more fuel. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mhm. So that's also part of the reason why, they're so focused on emission stuff is because now, okay, well, we've created another problem by removing fuel injection. Now we have to use more and more fuel because the back face of the valves on direct injected vehicles, which pretty much all vehicles are direct injected now. We have to find a way around this. Okay, so now another way around this is to go electric. So now you're seeing the big push for electric vehicles and a lot of four-cylinder turbos because these are small, tiny, fuel efficient, powerful engines, and it's impressive seeing the technology and how far it's come over the last 15 years. But like the Sierras now, the F-150s. I don't know about the Dodges, but like the F-150s and Sierras for sure, and Silverados, all have now a four-cylinder turbo engine. Which, if you're driving a truck, nobody wants a four-cylinder turbo. Absolutely nobody wants to drive a four-cylinder full-size truck. Everybody wants a big old 5.3 liter, 6.2, 6 liter, whatever. They want a big old V8 because that has what's called the rotating mass, which is the total rotating mass of the crankshaft to pull whatever they're going to pull. Even though most people use trucks as grocery getters, um, they want that. But the manufacturers are trying to push more and more people into these four cylinders because they're more environmentally friendly. So now you're also seeing, like I said, the explosion of electric vehicles, but nobody wants electric vehicles either because they're just so insanely expensive. But they're good for the environment, or at least that's what we're told.
Yeah, yeah. So, I do have to ask,
Yeah.
how did the Pinto lawsuit affect the industry?
Oof. With the whole exploding Pintos.
Yes, yeah. In the 1970s, my brother owned one,
Mhm.
although it was an upgrade from a Vega.
I have to imagine that was probably more like safety stuff. So like vehicles since like the old, we're talking the olden days, like the 70s, 60s and stuff, they have gotten a lot safer. Like the rollover, the total crumble area and everything has greatly improved. And they're also a lot lighter. I have to imagine manufacturers are probably looking at that and being like, all right, we can't have exploding vehicles on the road. Like the old Jeeps, actually from the 90s, were having that same issue where if they got rear-ended, the hitch would go into the gas tank and potentially create a fire hazard. So I have to imagine the manufacturers probably looked at that and thought, okay, well, we have to find a different way or a different place to locate the gas tank. So they probably had to make them a little bit lighter, also make certain structural changes. So like a lot of vehicles now have a structural bumper up front rather than like metal panels the whole way around. Like if you look on most new vehicles, they have a support fascia, or they have a fascia and then they have like a support bar behind each of the front and rear fascia. And most vehicles also have like crash sensors, which are basically a little gold diaphragm. And wherever the vehicle's hit, if that gold diaphragm moves a certain amount, like if it reads, let's say 1 volt instead of like a half a volt at normal, then it knows, okay, we're going to complete this circuit. We're going to detonate the deployers to pull the seat belts, and we're going to that it's also going to deploy the airbags so that way when the person driving the vehicle goes forward, that airbag hits their face rather than their face hitting the steering wheel. So basically I think like a lot of those Pinto lawsuits probably just said like, hey, we have to make these vehicles a little bit more safe, add more airbags, and also relocate the gas tanks so that way when people get rear-ended it's not as deadly.
I'm based on personal experience. I was in a very bad accident
Mhm,
in a Ford Explorer
mhm,
with no airbags. I had my seatbelt on. I was fine.
mhm.
This seems to be one of the first things where where they're almost seeming like they wanted to make cars more expensive. I don't know if airbags have really improved safety that much. So why are we going into this trend where there just seems to be the government adding more things that we don't, or government telling us to add things that we don't need?
I think it's kind of like this whole liberalization, and some people would call it the pussification of America, where we're just trying to engineer everything as safe as possible. So, like in some of the vehicles I work on, you would be absolutely amazed at the number of modules in a vehicle. Like there's a module, like a computer for the headlights at this point. There's multiple modules for the safety system and all this stuff. I think they just want to make these vehicles meet safety ratings as much as possible. So another thing that you might have noticed and you might not be aware of, if you look at a lot of vehicles now, you'll notice that the windows are actually getting smaller and smaller and smaller. If you look back in the day, the windows on some vehicles were a lot taller, but now they want to have actually the crumple zone, as they would call it, be as small as possible. So, like if you look at like a newer Camaro, those windows are tiny because if it falls on its roof, they want to have as little room as possible for that to potentially, sorry about that, to crumple as possible. So they make windows smaller and smaller and smaller, so that way not only are they more aerodynamic, but also the safety ratings can go up. So like the smaller vehicles, like your Sparks and stuff, they had like 43 airbags in them, but that was because they want to make them as safe as possible to meet safety ratings. Yeah, just everything's just so over engineered at this point.
But this is also pricing people out of buying cars at all.
Yeah, yeah, honestly, and this is kind of why you see prices on vehicles going up so high is because newer vehicles are so unaffordable, and especially with the interest rates going up, which you and I is kind of like Austrian. Good.
And I didn't have anything to say.
Okay, I thought you did. I'm sorry. But basically, like us as Austrian economists would understand that like when you raise up interest rates, it's supposed to rein in inflation. But the same problem with that is now people trying to get cheaper vehicles are now kind of priced out of those cheaper vehicles because now everybody wants to go to the used market. So if there's more demand for used vehicles, the price for those used vehicles is obviously going to go up. So a lot of people are priced out of the used market now, and they're usually going to newer vehicles because newer vehicles you can get a lower interest rate, better APR or whatever. So yeah, just the whole car market's completely changing. Most GM vehicles, like our cheapest one, as far as I know right now, would be like a Buick and Vista. You can get those for about $25,000, but I mean, that's still a hefty, price to pay every single month, especially at like a 10-12% interest rate. You're looking, most people are probably going to pay anywhere from like $400 to maybe $700 a month for even a more affordable vehicle. So like I joke about it all the time. Even though I make decent money, I can afford the vehicles that I work on. I work on Cadillacs, GMCs, Buicks mostly, occasionally Chevys, but I don't work for a Chevy dealer, even though they're under the branch of General Motors. I'm priced out of most GMC vehicles because I'm looking at some of the trucks, and like some of the base model trucks are like 60 grand. I'm like, okay, well, that's as much of my mortgage. I ain't getting that.
Yeah, and this is the thing, when you're, well, also, I have there are a lot of things that I don't think are necessarily improvements. I would love to have my manual windows back. And
Yes.
as far as safety is concerned, if I'm in the water, I'm better off with manual windows.
Mm-hmm.
Or if
Absolutely.
the electric, I mean, I know of situations where people had to be busted out of their cars because they didn't have manual windows.
Yeah, and that's a horrifying thought. So, funny enough, people might be surprised by this, but I did not actually get my first manual or my first power window vehicle until literally February of 2024. So, I drove manual windows from the time I first started driving about 2012. I just got my first one 2 years ago, which is the yellow Cobalt I drive right now. Now, we had my wife's car, but like the car that I owned and I drive the most is my Cobalt with power windows now. And I was perfectly fine driving. I honestly miss the last car I owned, which was a 2007 Cobalt with a manual transmission and manual windows. Absolutely loved that car. It hardly even sipped gas. I think probably got almost 40 miles to the gallon. I was never filling that thing up. It rode nice. The windows went up and down real easily. Just lots and lots of cool stuff. Yeah, that's awesome. But yeah, like I'm a big fan of manual transmissions, which you can hardly ever get those anymore. But part of that also does go to the demand. Like a lot of people don't really look for that kind of stuff anymore. Everybody wants creature features. Like almost every vehicle I get in now has heated seats. And for people like you and me, like, despite the fact that I'm a mechanic, I just want something simple. Dude, just give me if I get another car like my Cobalt, manual windows, manual transmission, it has an aux cord so I can listen to podcasts, music if I want to. I'm absolutely delighted. But you can't really get that anymore. Like I was surprised back in 2015. So we're talking 10 years ago when I worked for the Chevy dealership that I work for out in Ohio. We got a 4-cylinder Canyon with a manual transmission. I'd never seen one. That was the only one I've seen in my entire career. I was like, holy crap. But like, that'd be cool to have. Like you used to be able to get those old S10 Extremes back in the late 90s, which had a, little 2200, which didn't run for dog shit, but it was like, hey, I got a small truck. It's reliable. It's good on gas. It has a manual transmission. That's all I need is a dude just, driving back and forth to work.
Yeah, that's all I need to, and I absolutely hate this thing in my car that I put a bag of groceries on the passenger seat. And it says, "Oh, you got to fasten your seatbelt because it feels the weight of these groceries."
Yeah, so there is what's called the the passenger presence system in a vehicle now. So basically, they're trying to go back to an earlier point, make everything as safe as possible. So you obviously don't have a passenger presence system in the driver's seat because they're assuming if the vehicle's on that there's a driver there, right? Um, Funny enough, thinking back to like the old 2011-ish Cadillac CTSs, which are like I like those vehicles quite a bit. There is actually a bulletin, which is basically just like information put out by General Motors. If you put like a scan tool or something in the passenger seat, it would turn on the airbag light because it would assume that there's like a child or something in there because it wasn't heavy enough. Like most of those passenger presence systems, if you have at least 80 pounds in there, it recognizes that as a person. But if it has less than that, then it thinks you have like a kid or something in there and you shouldn't have it on. So it wants you to it wants you to buckle the seatbelt because it assumes if you put groceries in there, hey, there's a kid in that seat, buckle that seatbelt, you maniac. But um, like that passenger presence system. So now we're talking about adding stuff to a vehicle where you have a passenger presence system. Now you have power controls, you have an airbag, you have an airbag light, you have a serial or not a serial data gateway module, you have a I can't remember like a passenger presence system that basically just makes sure inflatable safety and restraint module. That's what it's called. To basically make sure that if somebody's in that passenger seat, the airbag deploys in the passenger seat. So they just over engineer all this stuff. You have roof rail airbags that go from basically like down in where you see the A pillar going to the dash, the whole way to the back C pillar where it goes into basically the trunk of the vehicle or like the back truck. So, and then you have airbags usually in the sides of the seat. Like they just have airbags and technology all over these vehicles. Are they safer? Yeah. But once again, when you keep adding more and more technology and all these airbags obviously require something to trigger them, which like I was saying earlier, there's a little amount of gold in all of these crash sensors, which there's usually a crash sensor in each door. You have two or three crash sensors in the front end of every vehicle, and then two or three crash sensors in the rear of the vehicle. So we're talking about a little bit of gold in every single panel of the vehicle, pretty much, just to make sure that obviously in the event of an accident, if that little diaphragm shifts enough, that an airbag goes off.
Yeah, that's what gets me. Those all this stuff costs more money. It
Mhm.
seems like to me it's just there to drive up the price.
I definitely believe there is an element of that. I also believe, like I said, they want vehicles to be more safe so that way people don't get hurt as much. Now, you could also provide conflicting reports of when people have seatbelts on. You could potentially face neck issues. Like I actually had wrecked my Monte Carlo. I have an 84 Monte Carlo when I was about 17 years old. And it actually dislocated a bone in my neck. Not like bad enough to the point that I was like permanently injured by it, but I still have issues with my neck every here and there. But you can make the argument that, okay, if I didn't have that seatbelt on, then I would have went through the windshield. Um, and not always, but I've also had a friend that I used to work with years and years ago now, who he had a seatbelt on and it permanently fucked up his neck. So just kind of cost and benefit, where he had a chiropractor that said, like, okay, if you didn't have your seatbelt on, you would have been fine. It wouldn't have messed up your neck. Everything, as Thomas Sowell would say, everything's a trade-off.
Yeah, I had a guy on who actually made a case against motorcycle helmets for safety.
Mm,
He
I
said they
think
take away his peripheral vision.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other side of that would be if you if you wreck and hit your head first,
Yeah.
then
Well,
I think that's pretty obvious. Yeah.
he told me I will wear my helmet on long distance trips, but I
Mhm.
don't wear my helmet around town.
Yeah, I think that's fair. If you're going a certain speed, there is a certain point where you understand, like, as you go faster and faster, obviously the likelihood that you're going to get hurt is higher and higher. So, one interesting thing to go back to an old racer from the 90s, I can't remember his name, but the reason why like race cars actually have like a cage around the head and usually like a strap or something to keep the head in, you have what's called a Hans device, right? So
Yeah.
when whoever hit the wall, Dale Earnhardt or whoever, when he hit the wall, it wasn't actually the hit that killed him. It was actually the force. So it actually isn't the speed that kills you, it's the immediate stop that does. When he hit the wall, it actually severed his neck from his head, which is what
Yes.
killed him. So that's why you have a Hans device, which when you crash, your head is going to hit that bar rather than getting, you know, thrown forward and separating your neck from your spine.
Yeah, I still remember where I was when I heard that news.
Hmm.
That was and nobody has died on the cup on that series since.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously safety is a
Almost
very, very
25 years now.
yeah, that's a long time for people to go without dying, but they make sure, the safety is obviously a big deal on vehicles, but we do kind of get to the point of, okay, well, we need to figure out affordability versus safety. And the correct answer to that, I honestly don't know.
I think you just got to let people make their own decisions.
Hmm. Right. And I think I don't know if this necessarily even push back to that point, but it's also kind of like, well, what decisions are available to the people? Like we were kind of talking about a little bit earlier. Cars are basically illegal now because they're in a different cafe standard than trucks and SUVs. So like people don't really have the choice of having an affordable vehicle anymore, which is just complete and total bullshit because like people should be able to get a vehicle. Like I want another the next car I'm probably going to get is going to be like a Chevrolet Sonic. They don't make those anymore. The Chevy Sonic or like a Chevy Cruise, they don't make those anymore, which sucks because I really like those vehicles. They were pretty good. Every vehicle has its issues, but like, they're just you can't get those anymore because now in the domestic United States, you just can't get them.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I think, I really also think that because there's so many people saying, mass transit is great, buses are great, and all this stuff, I really feel like there is a conspiracy to get us out of cars.
I think that's a
And, and,
reasonable
and maybe I may, and maybe that's a little paranoid, but it just seems like there is one.
no, I think that's a reasonable suspicion, and it's also like you allow people who wouldn't normally be in some neighborhoods to have access to different areas. Like I've heard from a lot of people that like once they put in bus stops in their neighborhoods, that like the quality of the neighborhood does drastically go down. Now, am I like against mass transit and public transportation? No, not necessarily, but there is this push, and you see it a lot more with vehicles where they're offering people leases. So obviously there's this big, the saying always is you'll own nothing, you'll be happy. But like leases are becoming more and more affordable options for people because you don't really own the vehicle. Now you're basically just renting a vehicle for a couple years. For someone like me, I drive 25 miles just to get to work.
Yeah,
I couldn't drive a lease because I drive way too much. Now people who live closer, okay, maybe that's a reasonable option. And for some people, I'm sure that's great. But for other people, I kind of like owning my vehicles. My wife and I don't have a
yeah,
car payment anymore. We paid off her terrain right before my daughter was born, in July last year. So I don't want a car payment, but some people are okay with just having this perpetual car payment. But this also goes to the whole concept that a lot of manufacturers have kind of pushed people into is this whole idea of like 5-year throwaways, where as soon as the powertrain warranty's out, oh, all right, next vehicle. So basically, like you're in this constant cycle of either leasing or paying for a vehicle, and everything's covered by the warranty. I put tires on it, and then as soon as it's out of powertrain warranty, I sell it, get rid of it, and then I move on to the next vehicle. Well, I think, and perhaps this might be a little bit of something useful to take away for people. Um, there's a market of vehicles usually sold from dealerships called pre-owned, right? So you're basically buying a leased vehicle that someone turned in. This is actually probably the best way to buy a newer vehicle because you're letting somebody else take that equity hit, and then you're buying the vehicle. And my personal piece of advice to anybody buying a newer vehicle now, not financial advice, I'm not a financial advisor, but I'm just telling you from my experience as a technician, get an aftermarket warranty the moment you buy a vehicle, because I promise you, 9 times out of 10, paying $110 deductible is way better than paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for vehicle repairs. You're better off just paying for maintenance rather than paying for, this ridiculous amount for automotive repairs. So like most vehicles now too, and this goes to something else that I think you probably wanted to talk about, the unserviceability of a lot of vehicles nowadays as well. Pretty much to do a headlamp on any vehicle nowadays, you're taking the bumper off. And nobody can do that in their driveway. For me as a mechanic, I'll have that bumper off in 15 minutes. I love it. I make tons of money on doing bulbs. If you give me a bulb a day, or like 3 or 4 light bulbs a day, I would not have a bill in my name because how much money I make on them. I'm very good at taking bumpers off General Motors vehicles. I'll do it all day, every day. It's very easy. But for the average person, you can't do that. And part of that is, once again, purposefully making it that way. Another thing about serviceability, they don't have transmission dipsticks anymore. They have little check plugs on the side of every single transmission, which basically you have to get the vehicle up to operating temp, take the plug out. If fluid drips out, okay, your fluid's good, put the plug back in. But once again, most people don't really they don't have the expertise, they don't have the ability to check it anymore. You also think about even brakes nowadays. Most vehicles have electronic parking brakes, which when you go to clamp a rotor, right, which is basically what the brake system does, you have brake pads, and those pads grab the rotor to slow the vehicle down. Um, they have electronic parking brakes on them, which at any given moment, sometimes just no reason at all, that sometimes may apply 3,000 pounds of pressure just to make sure the vehicle's not going anywhere. Like I drove a Acadia home for a customer to basically see if I could find anything wrong with it. Um, Me and my one coworker were just sitting there bullshitting, and literally like 20 minutes, maybe even a half hour after the vehicle shut off, the parking brakes applied. No idea why. No idea why they just randomly applied. So now imagine you are doing brakes, you're sitting there, you get the rotor off, and then you're trying to compress the piston in, which is already difficult enough to do on electric or on an electronic parking brake system. And let's say you have your hand in there and that piston decides to apply, you'll lose your fingers. You're going to the hospital. You may have to have your hand amputated because it's going to crush your fingers without a doubt. But once again, they want to basically have all of the service done by the manufacturer now at this point. And you sent me a few videos and I did watch them. I'm a little conflicted on this because like people fixing their own vehicles, I'm like at this point, a lot of the times they usually end up in the dealership anyways, and then they have to spend even more money because the parts they put on were junk, or they fuck something up in the process of trying to fix it with newer vehicles. But also people having the liberty to fix their own vehicle does provide lower income people a little bit of a better way to help offset the costs that are being imposed upon them by the auto manufacturers and the government.
My brother has always changed his own oil, for example.
Mhm. Yeah, so like most vehicles now, you could still probably get away with that, but I know on like some of the European manufacturers, they don't have like a drain plug anymore. Like I've seen, there used to be a couple Audi technicians that worked across the shop from me in the last General Motors shop I worked in, and they used to have like a little vacuum tool that they would stick down in the engine that would suck out all the oil. Okay, well, granted, most people who work on or who own an Audi and can afford an Audi probably aren't changing their own oil, but that's another way that vehicles are just kind of going away from this serviceability. So, real quick side tangent about like doing brakes on stuff. On a newer GMC truck, they have brake pad wear sensors that go into the bottom of the brake pad. If you do not set those brake pads right, and if you do not have everything like coordinated right, it'll set a check engine light, which sounds absolutely nuts, but basically has the brake control module say to the engine control module, hey, we have a brake leak here, even though you don't. So we need you to limit the power to the engine and make sure you don't go over 55 miles an hour because, it could be potentially unsafe. So that's another way that they're trying to get people out of doing their own brakes, is because now there's just so many different things intertwined in there. Like to even go to a more complicated level, when you turn the wheel in most newer vehicles, they have what's called a steering wheel torque sensor. So how fast you're turning that wheel, there's basically like a little gear down inside the steering column, and how fast you turn that is going to break a magnetic field, which sends a certain voltage to, let's say, the steering control module, which goes to the suspension control module, which is going to tell the suspension, hey, this asshole's turning this wheel super fast, so we need to really stiffen the suspension. Or it's going to say, hey, we don't want to shift into second gear, we want to shift into third gear, so that way it's not as aggressive. Or we're going to suppress spark. Like all these modules all talk to one another. And back to your point, this drives up the cost of vehicles because there's just so much going on in them now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't. Yeah, and I also have this sensor that tells me a tire has the wrong kind of air, but it doesn't tell me which tire.
Okay. So General Motors has a
that is really annoying, though.
Yeah, General Motors has individual TPMS sensors. So there's actually another reason why, they had to make vehicles lighter and lighter, and why they actually have to have those systems in vehicles now. Back in 2013, they actually required all vehicles have tire pressure monitoring systems. Okay, so why do they have to have that? Because a tire that's low on air needs to spin or rotates actually more than a tire that's bigger, because it's going to require more force to move it. So in order to reduce emissions, they want you to make sure your tires are set to the right air pressure, because if all your tires are low, it requires more rotating mass to move that tire. So all vehicles past 2013 have to have tire pressure monitoring systems in them, because once again, it's an emissions issue. To another point about this, most vehicles, okay, back when AC first came out, we're going to do another little history lesson. They had R12, which is a type of refrigerant. So they rate refrigerants on global warming potential rating. How they come up with this number, I'm not exactly sure, but basically R12 was the old refrigerant. So back in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, they had R12, which had a global warming potential rating of about 10,000, 10 or 12,000, which is really, really high. So that means this stuff is bad, bad, bad news for the environment, right? So eventually they decide, okay, we're going to move over to R134. R134 had a global warming potential rating of about, I think it was like 100 or 150, right? So, okay, this is a little bit better for the environment. And from what I hear from older people is that like back in the day, it worked fucking awesome. Like R12 was incredible. And then when they moved over to R134, it worked. It was still good, but it wasn't as good as R12. Now they have R1234YF, which the global warming potential rating on that is actually about 1, right? The reason why they do this now, and this also goes to another point, is because once again, the emissions. Do you remember the old or like the new car smell, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that was actually a form of emissions that came off the plastics as well. So that's why when you get new vehicles, they don't have the new car smell anymore. So the California Air Resources Board does this emissions test where basically, obviously California is where a lot of this bullshit comes from, but they want to simulate driving a vehicle through a certain road in California and then measure the emissions that comes out of the engine and then also off of all the paints, the plastics, everything, right? So they drive it, they measure the emissions that come out of the tailpipe. Like this is why they do like dyno tests and stuff like that. So it's basically like a dyno is just you put the wheels up and then it stays in place and it rolls, it stops, it rolls, it stops. They measure the emissions that come out of the tailpipe, right? And then after they're done doing that, they actually put the vehicle in a room and then measure all of the emissions that come off the paint, the plastics, everything. Well, what they found out was that new car smell was a form of emissions. We can't have that. So we have to do away with the new car smell. So that's why they did away with that. And that's also why they did away with the old R12 and R134 is because they said, hey, we're putting out too many emissions here. So we have to reduce the total amount of emissions. No more new car smell. And we're putting 1234YF into everything. So you really see how just like, hopefully listeners kind of gathered the picture here is just like years and years and years. We're talking 60 years of stuff and 60 years of technology they've tried to stamp onto these vehicles to get them more and more emissions friendly, and now you end up with a a Buick Encore GX, which is just like driving a locker you might have get stuffed in high school on wheels.
Yeah, is it fair to say that maybe California regulates American cars more than the federal government does?
Yeah, maybe, but I think it's kind of like, they take their marching orders from, yeah, you're probably right. Basically, a lot of that stuff comes from California and then it goes to all over the country. So, like in Pennsylvania, we have certain counties that are non-emissions counties. So, like I live in Westmoreland County, that's an emissions required county. So basically, they try to find like the population density, and if there's like over a certain amount of people, over a certain amount of emissions, and they say, okay, well, you guys can't have a check engine light on your car because you're put too out emissions or too much emissions. So you guys have to do an emissions test every single year and make sure that all the emissions are good. Now, if you go over 3 miles that way from my house, you're in Armstrong County and they don't require emissions because it's a little bit more rural. Or if you go 15 miles that way, you're in Indiana County, you don't require it. But then if you go 10 miles this way, you're in Allegheny County and you require it. So it's just the way they come up with these rules are so arbitrary and ridiculous. Like Ohio has e-check. I think New Jersey has something like that, but like all over the country, they have these different emissions and state inspection standards to basically just make sure vehicles are safe and they're not putting out too much emissions. And this, once again, goes all under the cost of owning a vehicle and also the cost of vehicles.
Is there any active movement to get rid of vehicle inspections?
As far as I know, no. If there is, I've never heard of it. But yeah, I don't think that's happening. It's basically just like a state-run program where they say, hey, if you're out of inspection, then okay, you have to go get inspection. You have to go get your vehicle inspected. And like some of the stuff that's required for state inspection is so ridiculous. So like there's a joke in Pennsylvania, dust off the headlight aimers because the state inspectors are coming. Nobody, nowhere I've ever worked for in 15 years has ever pulled out the headlight aimers to check headlight aim on a vehicle because they say that's a state inspection issue. Nobody does it. But basically what a state inspection is just you make sure the vehicle's safe and okay to be going down the road. You make sure the suspension doesn't have excess play. There's no excess leaks. There's nothing that's going to be of safety to the driver or anybody else. this is kind of a sticky situation. I understand the libertarian argument of not having the state intervene in this, but at what point is it that we allow people to endanger others? A perfect libertarian solution, I'm honestly not exactly sure what that would look like, but it does create a lot of issues for people.
But it seems like inspections are going environmental and away from safety anyway. So,
Well, there's two different inspections, right? There's an emissions inspection and there's a state safety inspection. The emissions inspection is all about just basically environmental stuff. The state is basically safety. So, and some of that does have like environmental stuff, but the vast majority of it is kind of like, hey, just make sure the vehicle's safe to be on the roads. But all mechanics joke that like we have to inspect vehicles to make sure they're safe to be on the road, but we're not driving on roads that are safe for the vehicles. Like if you look in the definition of like abusive driving or like harsh driving, literally driving in Pennsylvania meets every single criteria of that definition. Heavy acceleration, poor weather, bumpy roads, excessive stop and go traffic, hills. They meet all the criteria of basically harsh driving for vehicles.
it's basically just driving in Appalachia.
Yeah. I've done it for my entire life.
And when you learn to drive there, you don't fear anything else.
Nope.
Oh, there's 100-foot drop. There's no guardrail.
Yeah. There's it was funny when my wife and I were down in Florida almost a month ago to the day, and we got in a truck for our rental, and I remember getting in the truck and it was in four-wheel drive. I'm like, what the fuck do you have four-wheel drive on for when you're in Florida? Dude, there's you make it rain, right? Are you four-wheeling? No, this truck's clean as a whistle. Why do you have four-wheel drive in Florida? Like people see the lightest bit of snow and then they forget how to drive down in Florida. But me, like I got four snow tires on my Cobalt. I'm always reminded of when I lived in Ohio, because I lived in Ohio for about a year and a half when I was in college. There's a giant mountain of snow in the parking lot, and my Cobalt just went right over it. No problem. But yeah, people down south, they have no idea what they're doing if they see the slightest bit of snow. Like the whole world shuts down. Us here in Pennsylvania are like, all right, well, let's get the snow blower, let's get the shovel, let's dig our way out. We'll be all right.
Yeah. Is there anything else we've missed as far as things that have made cars more expensive?
Not off the top of my head. If you have any questions, let me know. If there's anything you feel like we missed, I'll try to address best I can.
I can't think of anything else right now. I just wanted to cover as much as we could. Well, now we're going to have these. Wait, now we're going to have these kill switches, that scares the crap out of me. Should scare anybody.
Yeah, I agree. What I think people are missing with this, though, is that vehicles and like the different modules in vehicles are infinitely more complex than most people understand. In 15 years, I've never seen anybody able to hack a vehicle and be successful with it. And now they have modules in there, like a redundant, what's called a serial data gateway module, to basically make sure that you can't do that. And there's all sorts of different data lines in vehicles, and this is another thing that costs money to go up, is that now you have, like I was talking about earlier, about how each module talks. All these different modules in a vehicle talk on a different network, which requires lots of wiring, which is typically copper or bronze. And that's obviously going to drive price up, because now you have to have all these microchips, you have to have all these wires, all sorts of different stuff, solder, different connector ends. So there's lots of stuff that just goes into making a vehicle now. But I do fundamentally agree that like there should be no such thing as a kill switch for a vehicle, because obviously that's very unsafe for people, and that's just you're interfering with someone's own property, because a vehicle is your property.
Yeah. What kind of red flags should people look for if they're buying a used car?
I would look at the vehicle's history. It's no matter what you're going to buy, you're inheriting some degree of risk. I would try to maybe look into like manufacturer warranty stuff, like see if they had like a lot of warranty complaints, which you can typically go to, or you might be able to access that through like third party information like Carfax or something like that, Carfax or whatever. A lot of that stuff can be a little bit of a help, but regardless, you're still inheriting some risk. Like if anybody is looking at like a GM vehicle, my DMs are always open. I can always look at the vehicle history for you through General Motors and see like what warranty repairs are done. So like when my wife got her vehicle, I was able to see, oh, actually, this vehicle was serviced at the dealership I worked for, and a friend of mine worked on this vehicle multiple times. And then, now obviously ever since I've owned the vehicle, I've serviced it. Um, some other things to look out for, I would just make sure you, like I said, always get an aftermarket warranty if you're buying a pre-owned vehicle. That would be my best bet. If you're buying a brand new vehicle, you're gonna take a little bit of a kick in the balls, but you may get a better interest rate, you may get better APR, maybe there may be dealer incentives, but yeah, I would probably avoid buying vehicles with high mileage or vehicles that were used as like loaners or a vehicle from like enterprise or anything like that because people always say drive it like you stole it or drive it like a rental. So um yeah, my best bet for people looking to get a newer vehicle would definitely be like buy lease turn-ins or something like that and then get an aftermarket warranty. If you have the money for it, if not, buying used vehicles could be pretty tough out there.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to buying my next car. I did well with retired rental cars too.
Mhm.
Uh, you
Okay.
know, they're going to change the oil and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, just generally try to do your best to at least investigate the vehicle a little bit. You could always get the VIN and then type it into the internet, and there might be some kind of results there. Or you should be able to find it through like the manufacturer, go to a dealership. A lot of shops will even allow you to do like a complimentary inspection. And if I were somebody listening to this looking for a new vehicle, it never hurts to, I'm sure a lot of dealerships would say, like, hey, we'll put the vehicle up on a rack for you and let you look underneath it. And hey, maybe you could pay $100 or something like that to have a technician you trust overlook the vehicle and just make sure there's nothing going on that you might need to know in the near future. Because all vehicles are going to require maintenance, some less than others, some more than others. But at least knowing what you're buying and having someone that you trust look at it is going to at least put you in somewhat of the best position to own the vehicle.
If somebody has never driven a manual, where can they go to learn to drive a manual?
Find the oldest guy you could find who knows how to drive one.
Yeah,
Honestly, I don't know any other better advice than that, but I mean, even that kind of breed of people's
that's
dying.
kind of sad, really. Yeah.
Mhm.
Manuals are still common in Europe and South America, though.
Yeah, I just think the skill got lost somewhere along the way here in America, which is tragic because I do enjoy driving manual transmission vehicles, honestly.
My brother is a dedicated Mustang owner. He's hardly had anything else.
Mm. Yeah, I tell them to switch over to Camaros or Corvettes. They're just cooler. But, of course, it's all personal preference. I am a General Motors guy, in case people didn't pick that up.
Have you been to the Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky?
No, my brother has. He bought me a hat from there. I would love to go there sometime. I've driven past it, but I've never been in there. As I said earlier, my grandfather, I don't know if I said this earlier, but my grandfather owned 14 Corvettes throughout his life. So Corvette's pretty much in my blood.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting. You can go through it in a couple hours.
Mhm.
Uh, I gotta say too, in Alabama, there's also a Mustang museum, but
Mm,
it's very different though. This is just two guys who really love Mustangs.
mhm. Yeah.
Whereas the Corvette Museum, I think, is owned by GM or something like that.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I would love to go to both of those because vehicle history is really cool. I did get to tour the Goodyear factory where they make tires when I was in college, which is really, really cool. So yeah, all that stuff really interests me.
Well, if you've ever been to Akron, there was a lot of tire production there.
Yep, that's exactly where the Goodyear factory was that I toured.
Well, the football stadium was called the Rubber Bowl.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's actually where one of the GM classrooms is that I've gone to numerous, numerous times. And when I lived in Ohio, I lived probably a half hour away from there. So I'm actually pretty familiar with that area. It's only
Yeah.
about 2 hours away from me where I live right now.
Well, yeah, you're in Westmoreland. Yeah, you're on the east side of Pittsburgh. Yeah, so you're not that far from Ohio anyway.
No, no, not at all.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of history, with of course you're not that far from Michigan either. So
I've been to Michigan as well for General Motors training. That's where I got all my electric vehicle training. And there used to be the Chevy Cruze factory in, oh, what the hell was it? It's somewhere in Ohio. I can't remember the exact town. It might be Youngstown, but that might not be correct. If you're driving from Pittsburgh to Cleveland, you'll pass by it. It's not there anymore. It's a giant factory. I know it every single time I see it. I used to kind of like smile every time I drove past it when I was driving home from college.
Well, Youngstown has lost a lot. I mean, they're actually going to go down to one public high school, and in the
Wow.
'70s they had six.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that town has really lost a lot. It's
Mhm.
there was also a lot of Jeep production, I think, around Toledo, and
Mhm.
just a lot, just a very interesting history around. It's the Rust Belt.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there were all sorts of GM training, places all around here, all sorts of factories, pretty much from Pennsylvania to Michigan, and now a lot of that's kinda gone away.
Well, also the Detroit Pistons, and they actually got started in Fort Wayne. That was
Mm.
another hub of maybe piston manufacturing. It's really wild.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they were the Zollner Pistons, actually.
mm, okay, yeah, they're having lots of trouble with pit well, I'd say probably, like, about from probably 2005 to about 2020, uh, GM and most manufacturers have a lot of issues with pistons and piston ring clearance, causing engines to use a lot of oil. So it seems like they figured that out, but they've also gone to a lot thinner oil for once again emission standards.
Yeah, it's really wild. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm
Mm.
surprised somebody hasn't come out with a new car company, but maybe it's just too hard to get one started.
Yeah, I mean, there's like BYD, but they're not allowed, pretty much not allowed to come into America, and that's an electric vehicle company that's overtaken actually Tesla over in China, and they
Oh,
export to pretty
wow.
much like yeah every country other than the U.S. So if that ever makes it to America, they're gonna have to tariff the shit out of it because their vehicles are so affordable and so reliable, and the range on them is actually a lot better than a lot of like the American electric vehicles.
I don't see how electric vehicles will ever take over, but who knows?
Yeah.
Uh, but I will say one thing: they're really quiet. They're almost too quiet.
Yeah, a lot of them have a like a speaker on the front end of it to basically allow it to give off some kind of noise. And like the Hyundais and the Kias are the absolute worst. They make this god awful beep. For those listening, just look up like Kia or Hyundai reverse sound. It's awful. Now GM uses what they call like a resonance from the sun. It's like a whirring, kind of like high pitch, not like high pitch, but like a medium pitch kind of noise so that way you hear them when they're moving. But then obviously when they're going fast enough, you don't hear them because you're, they're assuming that no one's going to be around the road. But like if you're driving around a parking lot, all vehicles have to have some kind of noise now, at least.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And maybe you're just not, and you just know that the car's there. You just want to be able to hear it. But
Yeah.
anyway, so where can we find you out there?
Of course. Well, Chris, first of all, thank you for having me on. I don't get to talk about this stuff that often. So hopefully your audience and everybody finds this show pretty interesting because this is information that's always in my brain, but I just don't talk about because I don't think most people are interested in it. But like I said, hopefully some people found it useful and helpful. And hopefully it kind of informs people of the automotive industry and how things have gone. So you can find me at Kyle Matovcik on Twitter. Last name is spelled Matovcik. I have a link tree where you can find everywhere that I'm at. Commoncrown.com for all my band's music. Go to the Great Megalodon, which is my Substack, where I talk about heavy metal and music. And Liberty and Health Podcast is my podcast, where I mostly do geopolitical analysis. And 5 Till Midnight, which is my Monday night show that I go live every 8 p.m. Eastern time on Monday. And then I've started doing shows on Wednesdays with my friend Nico House, who's a leftist, but we find a lot of agreement in different areas.
Oh, and I forgot. Tell us about George Lynch. You played with him.
Oh, yeah, the people who were with him were really, really cool. And yeah, the show was a lot of fun. I was surprised how packed it was, but yeah, that man can fucking play. He is very good.
Yeah, they were a good band.
Yeah,
Okay,
I would definitely play with them again.
please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel Escape from the Village, check out my Substack. People are giving me money, buy me a coffee. Thank you, Colin Matovcik. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainhead forum. Thank you.